Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 48, Queen Hortense of Holland, stepdaughter of Napoleon and mother of Napoleon III. We have a very special episode today. We're going to talk about Napoleon's stepdaughter, Hortense de Beauharnais, with a very special guest, Beatrice Knight. She's a fantastic author. She has a new book out called Alverstone, and you can learn more about Beatrice on her website, beatriceknight.com. Beatrice, how are you?
I'm very well, John. Thank you for the opportunity to podcast with you.
Yeah.
I'm excited to talk about Hortense de Beauharnais today.
Yeah, me too.
And thank you for the little plug for my new book.
Yeah, could you tell us a bit about that? I think my listeners would be interested in it just due to the time period.
Sure. Alverstone is set in 1813. It's a sweeping family saga, a love story at the centre, war, adventure. I take my readers on a trip from the ballrooms of London to various country estates in Shropshire, Yorkshire, the Highlands, and to Salamanca, to the Battle of Leipzig, and finally Wellington on the Pyrenees.
Wow.
So unlike most of the Regency romances, the lighter ones, I basically move location in my story. So it's a big, one of my reviewers called it Downton Abbey meets War and Peace. And that's actually quite a good description.
Okay.
So it's a big book.
Yeah. Sounds sweeping. You're going from London to Spain to basically the Pyrenees on the border of France. It sounds really interesting.
And, follow the fortunes of the heroes in the story, from their vantage point, as well as my heroine and her family.
Mm-hmm.
It is very much a family story and a big adventure, and it's part one of a series that I'm planning, a trilogy, and I want to move in the second book that I'm writing toward Waterloo and then the post-Waterloo politics.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm going to be going, of course, to the Duchess of Richmond's ball
Right.
in book 2.
Right.
The Napoleonic era, the Regency era, is such an enormous canvas. It's so rich in opportunities for writers. That's the field I'm also very interested in. So I'm interested in reenactments. I'm interested in all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And Alverstone kind of reflects it.
Yeah. Well, I think it's very timely. Your book just came out yesterday, Alverstone, and I recommend my listeners go check it out. You can find it, like I said, on Beatrice's website, beatriceknight.com. Can they get it on Amazon as well, or where else can they
Yes,
find it?
you can look it up anywhere, Amazon, Google Books, Apple Books.
Got it. Yeah, well, let's dive in. Hortense de Beauharnais was born in April 1783 in Paris. She was the second child to Josephine, future Empress Josephine of Napoleon, but she was married before to this guy named Alexander de Beauharnais. Can you tell us a bit about Hortense's early life?
Well, she grew up in turbulent times,
Mm-hmm.
to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, she and her brother, Eugene, were very, very tight with their mother as children because their lives were really catastrophic.
Mm-hmm.
She was only 11 years old when her father, Alexander, was executed in 1794.
Yeah.
And her mother, was in prison.
Yep.
It was terrifying. Were they all going to be executed?
Mm-hmm.
She learned, I think, in that time with her brother, they formed this incredibly intense bond, a survivor's bond. And I think it informed her for the rest of her life. She was always a survivor. She found ways, to take those childhood experiences of her father being executed, of seeing massive political change across a very small time frame.
Yeah, this is during the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror.
Yes,
yeah.
Swept up in this chaos, and also being a child and being powerless to do anything to save people around her. So I think that informed her, and it certainly informed her as her life evolved, and her mother, of course, met Napoleon.
Right. And I think that's the interesting part here is, it's amazing. Like in 1794, like you said, she's almost virtually, her mom's in prison, her dad's been killed. And then just 2 years later, her mom falls in love with the most powerful man in France at that time, or at least was about to become, Napoleon, who fall in love. How did Eugene and Hortense take to their new famous stepfather?
Interestingly, I think they were a little reserved at first because of their experiences, but I think, formed this very affectionate bond, and it seemed that Napoleon himself, perhaps because he was so crazy about Josephine,
Yeah.
but he really did go out of his way to be kind to her children and to really establish a true bond with them. And that was a lifetime bond, particularly for Hortense. She was incredibly loyal to him.
Yep.
She never forgot how good he was to her.
Mm-hmm.
And she was in desperate need of a father when he entered her life. Her father had been killed. And that was never a great relationship to begin with.
Yeah.
Her father, Alexandre, had actually disowned her as a child, as a small child. Then he came around and acknowledged she was his daughter.
Yeah.
But it was never a good relationship. Whereas I think Napoleon allowed her to make the most of herself as a young teenage girl, and she really had a marvelous life with him as her father, her stepfather.
I agree, and I think Eugene as well. Napoleon made him an aide de camp and kind of showed him the ropes in the military, which he didn't have to. He could have just said, Eugene, you just stay here in Paris with your mom. But he really took him under his wing.
He did, and Eugene, I think, again, because he and Hortense were so tight, that played really well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they both continued that loyalty to Napoleon all the way through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was reading, she's classically educated alongside Napoleon's Machiavellian sister, Caroline, at boarding school. And Hortense is described as a pretty girl with golden blonde hair and blue eyes. But there's more to her than that, right? She's pretty intelligent.
She is. She's not, in some regards, she wasn't what you might think of as just a kind of classic intellectual. She was clever and she had great instincts.
Mm-hmm.
She was often, everyone who met her, even as an adult woman, always said how amiable she was, how, they would enter a room with her and she would be the center of attention, but very gracious about it and warm and welcoming. And I think she learned those skills early. She loved her school. She loved being in that environment. And honestly, Caroline, I think, was jealous of her.
Yeah.
She had a sort of step-sibling rivalry going on because really Hortense was much more likable.
Yeah. And Caroline,
she particularly likable.
No, and Caroline despised her mother, and
absolutely.
So
yeah, there was no love lost, and as she got through that education, she, of course, as a young woman, she, started to look around her, and I mean, surrounded by handsome aides and everybody in the court of Napoleon, she certainly had her opportunities to come out in society and fall in love, and
yeah,
we know what happened to that.
Yeah. We're approaching that love story or lack of love story, I should say. But she develops a passion for fine art and music, and eventually composes rousing marching songs for her stepfather's army, like Partant pour Serie.
Yes.
Is she? She's written a lot of compositions, correct? Like she has a couple that she's.
Yes.
Yeah.
She was a notable composer, actually. I think had it been Eugene's compositions, perhaps there would have been more fame.
Mm-hmm.
But she was well known. She composed a number of military-style airs. She also wrote. She painted. Mm-hmm. She was not just an average painter, she was actually quite good.
Mm-hmm.
So she developed a love of the arts, and it enabled her to express things, I think, from this turbulent childhood. So her music is a little bit unusual for a woman of the time.
Yeah.
Most of her songs were marching songs,
mm-hmm.
and not surprisingly, of course, being Napoleon's stepdaughter, they got played.
Yeah. And I know her mom was a big patron of the arts, so I'm sure she encouraged that.
She did.
Yeah.
Josephine was, her salons were famous. And of course, Hortense had the opportunity to meet a lot of people of that mindset through her mother and her father, who encouraged her. So she flourished.
That's a good point. But returning to the love story aspect of her life, in 1802, she enters an arranged marriage with Louis Napoleon at the behest of her mother and stepfather. Louis is 24 and Hortense was 19 at that time. Was it a happy marriage, or what happened here?
Well, it didn't exactly get off to a good start. She was in love with General Giraud-Christophe Durer at the aide-de-camp of Napoleon's, and she would have, I think, liked to marry him, but she was tremendously loyal to Napoleon, and also she was under pressure from Josephine, her mother, not being able to have more children and not being able to have, a baby.
Right.
Wanted to really cement those family bonds. She wanted more than one arrow in her quiver. So she pushed for that marriage. And Napoleon also wanted his family to be bonded. And he, loved his stepchildren. So I think really that marriage came about. It was an arranged marriage, a political marriage, with his younger brother. And he, Louis Napoleon didn't mind. I think he was reasonably attracted to her. They produced 3 children.
Yeah.
I think he was fine with the marriage himself. I don't think he was madly in love with anyone else, and she would do.
Right.
But she was never in love with him, and they were a very awkward couple.
Yeah, I was reading about that. 4 years later, Louis appointed King of Holland with Hortense as queen. And, it sounds like every girl's dream. You get to be queen of a country, but Hortense wasn't thrilled about it. What do you think her reluctance was?
I think twofold. One, of course, was that she didn't love him, and they were now going to be dispatched to a newly formed monarchy in a place where the people weren't exactly thrilled to have Napoleon's brother, foisted on them as their king.
Right.
So the Dutch weren't eager. And she was young and inexperienced, but she wasn't stupid. She knew her limitations. She wanted to do the right thing by Napoleon. I think she felt that her relationship with Louis was on such a weak footing. How would they handle the pressure of this political situation where the Dutch weren't very welcoming?
Right. Yeah, obviously, the Dutch were conquered by Napoleon, so basically he's forcing his brother and Hortense upon them. But she's initially well received by the Dutch and grew to enjoy her new country. She visited marketplaces, made large purchases from merchants, which made her very popular. But at the same time, this seemed to annoy Louis, who was trying to get the Dutch to fawn over him. Like you said, they had kids together, so obviously there was some attraction there, but it sounds like at this point they kind of become estranged.
Well, I think of them as, if you think about a Charles and Diana couple, he thought he should have all the attention. He was not the most winsome of individuals,
charismatic, not so much. Yeah.
He wasn't charismatic. She outshone him. And also because of her arts background and her love of the arts, and she was elegant, she was cultured, very astute. She was talented, played music, artist. She became, in effect, an influencer in the New Kingdom, whereas he was really sidelined. He was basically Hortense's husband.
Yeah, and you're supposed to be the king. You're supposed to be number one, and you're not. Yeah.
And so he wasn't keen. And one thing she did that really, I think, made the Dutch value both of them more is that she really pushed the prominence of the Dutch in art. And they'd kind of been sidelined a little. So having this rebirth where she invited artists, she became a patron of the arts. The Dutch really liked that. Ultimately, Louis himself became more loyal to Holland.
Right.
He found that he had a role, and they did quite a lot of things together politically. So they formed, I guess you could say they were allies rather than lovers.
In 1807, though, her first son dies kind of tragically, and Hortense throws all of her energy into raising their second son, Charles Louis Napoleon, who becomes quite famous later in life. Do you think Hortense's efforts to raise this second son imbued some sort of brilliant charisma and problem solving into the future Napoleon III? He strikes me as kind of a clever opportunist and survivor like his mother and uncle.
He was very much her son. I think it was a stroke of luck in history that, it was terrible that, of course, his brother died ultimately, but Louis Napoleon, I think, never lost sight of the sense that France now belonged to his dynasty, or his stepfather's dynasty. And I think he never ever lost sight of that, in part because she reared him to become an emperor. That's my view.
Yeah.
And I think she instilled in him the family loyalty, the loyalty to country, the ethos, and also he became pretty charismatic himself.
He did.
And I think that came from her. It certainly didn't come from his father.
Yeah. So you wonder, did Hortense kind of pick and choose, things she liked from Napoleon and things she didn't like from Louis, and kind of integrated those into her son,
I think that may well be true.
Yeah.
And he was always the beneficiary of her particular style of very astute political maneuvering. She was good at it, and she taught him how to do it.
Indeed. Well, moving on in our story, in 1810, Napoleon forces Louis to abdicate the throne of Holland for putting Dutch interests above those of French interests. And this allows Hortense to return to Paris and separate permanently from Louis. It is also around this time that Napoleon divorces Hortense's mother, Josephine, to pursue his quest for an heir. How did Hortense deal with all this upheaval?
Well, she took lovers.
That helped. Yeah.
She had, I think it was a very difficult period. She fell in love with Charles de Fleury, who was Talleyrand's natural son. He was Murat's aide-de-camp. She rather scandalously got pregnant by him and had a son who became the Duke of Morny. The upheaval, I think, the interesting aspect of that upheaval, and I think something that helped her get through it, was that really both Napoleon and Josephine were heartbroken by it. That their letters to each other make it really clear that he did what he felt he had to do for France. He had to try to produce an heir. He had to somehow form an appropriate alliance with Austria. It was a very complicated situation. He'd been at war for a long time. He wanted to keep Austria in a box. It was a complex situation, and Hortense was smart enough to understand the politics, even though she was really devastated. And yet, even though he was divorcing Josephine, he maintained his very close bond with Hortense and Eugène.
Right, and they both of them very easily could have done that. They could have been like, "All right, well, you're divorcing Josephine, we're done with you," but they didn't. And
yes.
There's a great quote from Napoleon, and it's going to kind of lead into my second question. The quote is, "When you share in the rise of a family, you must also share in its misfortunes," end quote. Why do you think her and her brother, Eugene, were amongst the few who didn't desert the emperor when things started to go really bad in 1813 and 1814?
I think they took that very much to heart. I mean, they had such upheaval in their lives, and they had been through such political turmoil. I think they also, certainly Hortense, I think perhaps had a sense that this too shall pass. Her loyalty was absolute. Her loyalty to Napoleon as her father. He was her stepfather, but in her life, he was her father. And both Eugene and her. And I think that trumped everything. She understood also, I think, that her mother continued to have loyalty to him as well.
Right.
So
right.
I think it would have been odd for her to take the opposite course. She was also courageous. She had been through a lot. And so I think she trusted that perhaps destiny had something else in store. This too shall pass. I mean, one minute Robespierre was in charge, and the next minute he was beheaded. So, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. And I read something, and I touched on this in an earlier episode, like half of Napoleon's marshals had a parent die when they were young. Same thing with British prime ministers. More than half of them had a parent die when they were, young children. And not that I can correlate it, but they also had to rise through the French Revolution. The marshals did, as did Hortense and Eugene, with keeping their heads. So maybe, like we were talking earlier, that survivor instinct, you can get through anything if you can get through that.
And absolutely. And also Napoleon, I mean, think of his character. She could have faith that if anything was going to work out, he would make it happen.
Right.
He wasn't beaten.
Yeah.
He was still fighting. And I think she had faith that something might happen, and she wanted it to happen. And
she was right.
Course,
yeah.
She was right.
Yeah. Well, let's get to that. In 1814, Napoleon abdicates the throne. As you said, he was still fighting, but his marshals said enough. So they kind of forced him to abdicate the throne. And he was exiled to Elba. And a month later, tragically, Josephine dies at Malmaison. That must have been, talk about a bad 2 months for Hortense. That must have been awful.
And a double whammy in every possible way. And she was having a terribly hard time. Her husband, Louis, they were at odds. She actually became embroiled in a court case over custody of their children. So it was a very torrid time, and the loss of her mother, which, that was a curious thing too. During that period, she had gotten to know Tsar Alexander, and she completely charmed him. He really wanted to take care of her. So she had the ability, even through this turbulent time, she had a very powerful ally, and she had made an ally of him. Josephine had done the same. She tried to make an ally of him, and really her death was in part caused by her catching cold, wanting to show Tsar Alexander her roses by moonlight.
Yeah.
She wasn't well, but she went out in her flimsy garments and was charming him by moonlight, and essentially caught pneumonia and died from it.
Awful, yeah. But Hortense, she gets through that, of course, and Napoleon escapes Elba in 1815 and makes his triumphant return to Paris. And Hortense is one of the few to greet him at the Tuileries Palace. Her mother has died. Yeah, Eugene isn't there. He's with his father-in-law, I think, in Germany. So why do you think Hortense is there? What, she doesn't have to be there.
No, she didn't, although, as luck would have it, the court case she was embroiled in, the very day he returned, they rendered their decision. So she, in part, almost had to be there for that. But also, I think, she she was waiting for something to happen. I don't know if she caught wind of it, but I think she had some sense that there were a lot of wheels in motion, and she was in. I mean, she was there anyway. But of course, she was one of the first people to greet him. The people were happy to see him. And she said, when she greeted him, she said, "I had a presentiment that you would return, and I waited for you here."
That's amazing. Absolutely amazing.
So she had a real feeling about it.
Yeah.
And even though, you know, her life was in turmoil and a lot of people advised her to leave,
yeah,
she flatly refused.
No, yeah, she's a very courageous woman. So after Waterloo, which you'll talk about in your second book, King Louis XVIII reclaims the throne and banishes Hortense, along basically with all the Bonapartes, from France.
Yes.
What does she do in her later years? I know she travels a bit in Europe.
Well, she devoted a lot of her energies to raising her sons. So she had the two boys, Louis Napoleon and his brother, Napoleon Louis. I mean, why would you call them that?
Right.
But,
right.
I guess she had her reasons.
Yep.
But she never let them forget that they were, in her eyes, the legitimate heirs of Napoleon. She was very focused on their political futures, and she reared them accordingly. She brought them up. She also wrote her memoirs in those years. So those are some interesting memoirs to read. She got to work on them. She maintained contact with Louis, and her ex-husband, and they sort of came to terms about a lot of things. She also developed important friendships, and I think one of the most important friendships she developed was with Madame Récamier, who was, a famous mover and shaker politically, a woman who, was mistress of famous people, and she was a remarkable character. She really kept Hortense plugged into French politics.
Right. She had a lot of connections.
Yes. She was very connected. They exchanged a lot of letters. And so Hortense, she was in Switzerland. She was in different places. She really created a salon of its era. She was, it was full of political people, artists, intellectuals. She set up her own, in effect, a sort of court away from court. And she, I think in those years, really most of her goal was thinking about what she could possibly do to get her son really back to France. I think that was a focus of hers.
Yeah, and I know she worked with a lot of charities. She's a very courteous woman, wanting to make, and it just shows what kind of person she is.
Very much so. And she, she had this life where anybody with any real influence in Europe, she'd probably met them.
Yeah.
So she had all sorts of levers that she could pull, and she really, I think, thought ultimately that the restoration would not continue, that the Bourbon restoration would end. And I think she had a strong feeling about it because, in part, I think she had her finger on the pulse of the French people.
Yeah, and she was,
all her connections.
She was proven to be right. Unfortunately, though, she doesn't get to see her son, claim that top spot, which would have been probably a really amazing thing for her. I know.
It's a shame.
In 1837, she dies of cancer at the age of 54 and is buried next to her mother. What do you think her legacy is? And clearly a part of that must be Napoleon III, who ruled France longer than his more famous uncle. But what do you think? I guess you could answer that in two parts. Like, what is Hortense's legacy, and then I guess her son, Napoleon III, carrying on her legacy, I guess.
Yes, I think her son was her legacy. I like to think that she, she must have, if she could see from heaven, she would have seen just what really how well France did under him.
Mm-hmm.
That he really put down strong foundations.
Mm-hmm.
He had many years of peace in France.
Mm-hmm.
The country started having risen from the ashes of the revolution, having had this rather appalling restoration attempt that didn't work well for the people. Finally, they actually had, in effect, peace, power, and harmony
Mm-hmm.
under her son, and so he was her legacy.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I think of her legacy as setting a standard for women and girls of the era to take a more political view, to see her as a role model, and many did. And in history, I think she's underrated. Very few people would have survived what she had survived and would still have been able to wield political power. I mean, she really was an interesting person. She was truly an influencer. And looking back at her as a woman in history, I think of her as really an extraordinary role model.
Yeah, to have nothing. To have like almost nothing when you're 11 years old, then to become queen of a country not long after that, then to lose it all again, then to build up your son enough where he gets to become king of a country. I mean, it's almost a book, if you don't mind me saying.
Well, it kind of is a book, and I have thought about writing it, and others have written, about Hortense, but I would really like. She's going to appear in my second book. A number of historical characters actually do appear in cameos in my book, Alderstone. I have a number of historical figures just kind of passing through the story.
Right.
Sir Charles Stuart, of course, Wellington, different people, and in book 2, the Duchess of Richmond, Lady Blessington. I mean, all of these people are going to have little cameos, and of course Hortense.
Yeah.
It's a good opportunity for me because the timing's completely perfect.
Yeah, and I think they're larger than life characters.
Introduce her story and depict her as a role model. So that's I would love to write a much longer book on her, but that's probably several books away for me.
Yeah. Well, maybe that'll be your nonfiction entry. That you'll do a couple of fictions and then do a nonfiction on Hortense or something like that.
If I were going to do one on anyone, it would be her.
Yeah.
So that's I have a very strong interest in her life.
Yeah.
And thank you for giving me the chance to talk about her.
Oh yeah, you did fantastic, and I learned a lot, and hopefully my listeners did as well. She was an intriguing woman, and I think an integral part of Napoleon's empire.
Very much so, and I think he viewed her that way too.
Yeah, and treated her as such, which is more, even more important. So
a high compliment. She wanted to earn her stepfather's loyalty, approval, and love, and she did so.
Agreed. Well, Beatrice, thank you so much. Again, the website for Beatrice is beatriceknight.com. If you want to learn more about her or her books, check it out. And thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. I very much appreciate it, John. And you have a great day. And thank you to your listeners for tuning in.